A hairdresser's daughter from Kent married into the Rothschild banking dynasty, divorced after 5 years, and asked for almost nothing on the way out. 9 years later, in November of 1980, she and her closest friend drove into the mountains of central Italy in a black Peugeot and were never seen alive again. Their car turned up 17 days later, locked and parked neatly at the roadside with no sign of a struggle, a woolen scarf still folded inside, and their snowshoes untouched on the back seat. 14 months after that, hunters found their remains 5 kilometres from the car, scattered across 200 square metres of forest. Both women's watches had stopped on different days, a full week apart, yet both froze at the identical time. For 44 years, Italy called it an accident. Then in 2024, a prosecutor in Macerata reopened the file as a double homicide, and the man who had tried to warn them off that mountain in the first place was called back to give evidence. His warning, given on the morning of their last day alive, was plain enough. I told her to be careful, and not go to the mountains because of the snow. A single name runs through this entire story like a wire pulled too tight, and everything that has gone wrong with the case can be traced back to it. The Rothschild name opened doors that a girl from her background had no natural right to walk through, and for a few years in the late 1960s, it made her one of the most quietly enviable women in England. Then, decades after the marriage that gave it to her had ended, that same name became the gravitational centre of every theory about how she died. It pulled in Sardinian kidnappers and coded telegrams, and a stabbed antiques dealer, and a dead Vatican banker, and even an alleged plot against the Holy See, until the 2 actual women who lost their lives on an Italian mountain were nearly buried a second time under speculation. That is the paradox at the very centre of this episode, and it has kept the case alive for more than 4 decades. The facts that get lost in every retelling can be stated plainly at the start. She married Sir Evelyn de Rothschild in 1966 and divorced him in 1971, and by the time she disappeared in 1980, she had remarried years before and was legally Mrs. Stephen May. Yet she went on using the Rothschild name after the divorce, on her own passport and when she checked into hotels, a habit that seemed harmless at the time and that the later theories would seize upon as though it were a clue instead of a convenience. She had not been a Rothschild wife for 9 years when she vanished, a distinction that almost every headline written about her has quietly and consistently ignored. The story you probably half remember is about a glamorous ex-Rothschild lost in a blizzard, and almost every part of that sentence needs correcting. The second woman in the story is Gabriella Guerin, an Italian who was her friend, her assistant, and her interpreter, and who died beside her. Guerin was a person in her own right and not a name appended to a Rothschild's, though she has spent 4 decades being treated as exactly that. The reason the correcting matters is that the errors are not innocent. When a story is told as tragedy, it asks for sympathy and then closes. When it is told as mystery, it asks for suspects, and suspects have to come from somewhere. The moment the Rothschild name entered the case, the somewhere became limitless, and the Sardinian kidnappers and Vatican bankers and mafia killers all arrived as though summoned by the 6 syllables of the surname itself. What that machinery of speculation has obscured for the better part of 4 decades is the far quieter and far sadder thing, that 2 real women died on a mountain, and that their deaths happened to actual people with mothers and children and full lives of their own. Stories like this one, where a real human being vanishes behind a famous surname and never comes back out from behind it, get the fuller treatment they deserve in our free Substack newsletter, well past where a single documentary episode has to stop. The May case, with its 2 women and its 44 years of unanswered questions, earns a place in that company as fully as any story we have covered. The legend on the Italian mountain began far from Italy, in a small corner of wartime England, with a baby whose father was already dead before she could remember his face. She was born Ellen Dorothy Jeannette Bishop on January 3, 1940, on the Isle of Sheppey in Kent, an only child whose life was marked by loss from its very first months. Her father was a sergeant in the Royal Air Force, serving in one of the war's most dangerous specialist roles, bomb disposal. In 1940, only months after his daughter's birth, he was killed while attempting to defuse a German device during the Blitz, one of the many quiet casualties of a task carried out with hand tools and only a primitive understanding of increasingly sophisticated German fusing mechanisms, where a single mistake was always the last one. His widow Susan was left to raise Jeannette entirely alone amid the grief and rationing and chaos of wartime Britain, taking work as a hairdresser to keep the household financially afloat. The demands of the job, combined with the total absence of a partner to share the childcare, eventually became unsustainable, and by the time Jeannette was 4, her mother made the wrenching decision to send her away to board at a Catholic convent school in Sittingbourne, Kent. Former classmates who later recalled her on local community history forums decades afterward remembered an active and social child, despite the distance from her mother. She played netball and took piano lessons and left a lasting enough impression that people were still trying to reconnect with her memory well into the 1950s and beyond, long after the convent itself had ceased to be a central fact of her existence. By any measure, it was an isolating start to life, a fatherless only child raised apart from her sole surviving parent, growing up inside the strict discipline of convent boarding, not a conventional family home. A convent education of that particular era was also, in its own severe way, a finishing school. It taught deportment, correct speech, self-command, and the small unspoken arts that separate one English social class from another. And Jeannette was absorbing all of it in a place that had taken her in only because her mother could not afford to keep her. Inside the convent she found the thing that would eventually carry her out of it, which was ballet and dance. It was a discipline that taught her the poise, the deportment, and the particular trick of making enormous effort look effortless, gifts that would prove far more valuable to her than any academic qualification she might otherwise have earned. She had little patience for formal schooling and showed no interest in continuing her education past a certain point. But the convent taught her something the classroom never could, the habit of appearing composed under scrutiny and of carrying herself as though she belonged somewhere she had not been born to belong. A girl who masters that trick early can carry it anywhere, and Jeannette was learning it in a place that had taken her in only because her mother could not afford to keep her at home. By her teenage years, she had blossomed into a striking, fair-haired, blue-eyed young woman, whose natural poise seemed to hint at a life well beyond Sheppey's modest circumstances. The convent walls could not hold a girl who had already learned how to perform grace on demand, and at 16 she made the decisive break that would set the whole course of her life. She left school at 16 and bet her future on beauty and poise instead of credentials or qualifications, a gamble that paid off almost immediately and handsomely. Her photographs appeared in Vogue, she built out a broader career doing television commercials, and she landed a recurring hosting role on the ITV game show Spot the Tune, presenting contestants and prizes to a national television audience with the poise of someone who had spent years practicing exactly that composure. She was assembling herself piece by piece, the way an interior decorator assembles a room, and that comparison is exact, because interior decoration and antiques became her true vocation. By 1961, still only in her early 20s, Jeannette had fully traded her modest Kentish roots for a permanent address at Bryanston Square in Marylebone, one of those cream-stuccoed London garden squares where a certain kind of moneyed respectability lived and was seen to live. The address was proof of how far she had already come from the convent dormitory and the hairdresser's wage, and she had covered the whole of that distance on her own earnings and her own nerve. She was already pivoting away from modelling toward the buying and selling and arranging of beautiful old objects. The choice tells you something important about the woman she intended to become. Modelling and television traded on youth, and youth expires. The antiques trade traded on knowledge and iron nerve, on the ability to know what a thing was worth and to hold your composure while you said so, and those were assets that would only compound with age. She was building deliberately a career she could grow old inside. Those who knew her in these years and in the years afterward consistently described her as independent-minded and warm, yet fiercely guarded about her private life, even as she moved more and more among the era's international jet-set of aristocrats and financiers and famous faces. She had crossed, in little more than a decade, from the class of people who served in grand houses to the class of people who furnished them, and she had done it entirely on her own earnings and her own taste. It was reported, though only as a secondary claim from one European source, that she was a niece of Sir Stanley Hooker, the celebrated jet engine engineer behind engines used in the Hawker Hunter and Concorde, though this family connection is not corroborated across most English accounts of her life. What she was not doing was any of the things the wilder legends would later credit her with. There was no political career, no seat on a council, no run for office, however tidy such a detail might make the myth of the self-made Rothschild bride. Her rise was made of modelling contracts, a television slot, and an increasingly expert eye for furniture and porcelain, and it was formidable enough on its own without any embellishment. It matters to keep the record clean on this particular point, because the same appetite for invention that would later hang kidnappers and coded telegrams and Vatican conspiracies on her death began, in a smaller way, with the tidying up of her life story into something rather grander and more strategic than it actually was. A young woman who could remake herself this thoroughly was exactly the sort who might, one day, walk into an American wedding chapel and out again with one of the great banking names of Europe. On September 30th, 1966, in Arlington, Virginia, Jeannette Bishop married Sir Evelyn Robert Adrian de Rothschild, and a hairdresser's daughter from Kent became part of the family whose name was a byword for money for 2 centuries. Evelyn was born on 29th August 1931 in Westminster, the son of Anthony Gustave de Rothschild and Yvonne Cahen d'Anvers, herself descended from the Bischofsheim banking family. He had spent part of his own childhood evacuated to the United States during the war, reportedly working behind a soda fountain counter in a New York drugstore, where he could indulge a lifelong love of chocolate, before returning to England to attend Harrow School and read history at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he left without completing a degree. He spent his young adulthood travelling, playing polo, breeding racehorses, and collecting fast and exotic sports cars before finally joining the family bank at the age of 26, eventually ascending to its chairmanship in 1976 and steering it for 27 years. He was almost 10 years Jeannette's senior, and by the time they met, he was widely regarded as among the most eligible bachelors in European high society. The gulf between his world and hers was enormous, and gossip inevitably swirled through London that the young model was simply angling for the Rothschild fortune. A close friend of the couple rejected the fortune hunter narrative flatly, calling it a love match rather than a money match, and by several accounts Jeannette was the very first woman Evelyn had ever proposed to, a detail friends treated as evidence that the relationship was genuine. The wedding took place in Virginia, partly because of Evelyn's own childhood years spent in America, and it placed Jeannette inside a world of grand houses and grander acquaintances almost overnight, socialising alongside Imelda Marcos and Henry Ford II. Chief among the residences was Ascot House, the Tudor Revival mansion, set in roughly 4,400 acres of Buckinghamshire, near the hamlet of Wing, the house where Evelyn himself had grown up dreaming, somewhat improbably given his surroundings, of one day becoming a cowboy. The property's history ran back centuries before any Rothschild set foot in it, through a Benedictine abbey seized during the dissolution of the monasteries, a stint hosting the young Princess Elizabeth under house arrest in 1554, and a long decline before Baron Meyer de Rothschild purchased what was then a modest farmhouse in 1873, and his nephew Leopold commissioned the architect George Devey to enlarge it into the elaborate country house it became. By the time Jeannette arrived as a young bride, the house had already been given to the National Trust in 1949 by Evelyn's own parents, Anthony and Yvonne, though the family kept private use of parts of the estate, making it one of the very few original Rothschild houses in Buckinghamshire still actively lived in, not operating purely as a public museum. Amid this household, staffed by what one account memorably described as a virtual army of butlers, cooks and domestic servants, Jeannette began to withdraw from the public modelling career that had made her name, growing noticeably more private as the years went on. It was the kind of ascent novelists spend whole careers describing, and that real life almost never grants, the fatherless daughter of a Kentish hairdresser seated at the tables of one of the richest families in Europe, and by every account she carried it off without a false step. She had reached the height a girl from Kent was told she could never reach, and within 5 years she would deliberately climb back down. The marriage lasted roughly 5 years and ended in divorce in 1971, and it is here that the gold-digger version of Jeannette Bishop falls apart entirely. Any woman who had married one of the richest men on earth and who wanted to punish him or to secure herself for life had every legal instrument available to do so. Jeannette did the opposite. The settlement she took was modest, and it was modest by her own insistence, a sum of £25,000 to be invested on her behalf by Evelyn, together with a townhouse in Chelsea on Cheney Row. She walked away from the Rothschild fortune with something closer to a comfortable independence than a windfall, and she chose that arrangement herself. The settlement was widely interpreted at the time and since as further proof that she had never married Evelyn for his money in the first place. The precise reasons behind the split were never made public, and both sides handled the divorce with an unusual grace and mutual respect that lasted for the rest of their lives. The two exes remained on notably cordial terms afterward, and Evelyn continued to speak well of his former wife in the years that followed. And in a gesture with real symbolic weight, he permitted her to go on using the Rothschild name even after the divorce was finalised, a name she carried on her passport and in hotel registrations for the rest of her days. It is difficult to square the image of a scheming social climber with a woman who leaves the marriage having asked for so little. A woman who marries for money does not leave the marriage refusing most of it, and a woman who wants the world to think her wronged does not accept a settlement so restrained that it makes her look, if anything, proud. A woman who marries for money does not leave the marriage refusing most of it, and a woman who wants the world to think her wronged does not accept a settlement so restrained that it makes her look, if anything, proud. Everything in her history, from the ballet lessons in the convent to the antiques trade she never abandoned, points to a person who wanted to author her own circumstances instead of banking on somebody else's. Evelyn moved on and remarried in 1973 to Victoria Lou Schott, with whom he had 3 children before divorcing in 2000, and he married a third time that same year, to the American businesswoman Lynn Forrester. By the time Jeannette disappeared in 1980, Evelyn had remarried 7 years earlier and had an entirely separate family, a fact worth remembering whenever a headline implies she was still a Rothschild wife when she vanished. According to Italian reporting, Jeannette's own assets grew over the following years, from something like 50 million lire around the time of the divorce to perhaps 500 million by 1980, though the true value of her English estate was never authoritatively established. There was nothing sinister in the habit of keeping the Rothschild name, and nothing unusual about it either, since plenty of divorced women keep a married name that has become part of who they are, and hers happened to be among the most recognisable names on earth. She had taken her freedom cheap and turned it into a life, and the second act of that life would centre on a friendship the conspiracy theories have never once thought to mention. Gabriella Guerin was born on September 27, 1941, an Italian woman from the small town of Ronchis in the Friuli-Venezia Giulia region of the country's northeast, and she has spent the last 4 decades being described, when she is described at all, as Jeannette's assistant, as though that single word were the whole of a human being. She had entered the Rothschild orbit as a cook in the household, one of the domestic staff whose labour made the ease of the family possible, and the two women were close in age, and found in each other something neither had expected to find across that particular class divide. A cook in a great house is not a guest in it. She is up before dawn, invisible by design, judged by the smoothness of a dinner she will never sit down to. Over the years, Guerin became far more than kitchen staff to Jeannette, becoming her secretary, her interpreter, and the person who managed the practical machinery of a life lived partly in Italy. The bond ran deep enough that Jeannette later became godmother to both of Guerin's children, once Guerin returned to Italy, married, and started a family of her own. That the friendship survived the end of the Rothschild marriage, and ran unbroken through Jeannette's years as Mrs. May, tells you that it belonged to the two women themselves, not to the household that had first introduced them. It was the kind of bond forged across a class line that most of their world would never have crossed. After the divorce, Jeannette had rebuilt her working life around antiques and interiors, buying in Italy and selling in England, moving between two countries and two languages, and Guerin was the person who made that trade possible. She spoke the language Jeannette did not, negotiated with the dealers and tradesmen Jeannette could not negotiate with alone, and kept the whole delicate operation running season after season across both countries. For a widow with children of her own to raise, the work was also a livelihood, a steady way of keeping a family fed by attaching her competence to another woman's ambition. And there is a quiet dignity in that arrangement that the lurid versions of the story never once bother to notice. When she climbed into that black Peugeot on the afternoon of November 29th, 1980, she was not a footnote to somebody else's story. She was a working mother whose own story ended on the same mountain. There is a hard forensic reason to insist on her full humanity, and it comes decades later. Her identity was not confirmed by DNA until 2006, through the work of Professor Franco Maria Venanzi at the University of Camerino, which is to say that for 24 years, even the certainty of who exactly had died beside Jeannette remained technically open. A woman with a name, a birthplace, a widowhood, and children whose own godmother was the woman lying beside her, was reduced for a quarter of a century to a set of remains awaiting scientific confirmation. To write her as anything less than a full subject of this story would be to repeat the very erasure the case has already inflicted on her. The life the two women shared in Italy had a physical centre, an old stone house in the mountains, and it was that house that drew them up the road on the day they died. In 1975, Jeannette met Stephen May, and within the year she married him, giving her the surname she would legally carry to her death. May was a serious man with a serious job, the personnel director at the John Lewis Partnership, the British department store chain, a point that needs stating clearly because some Italian press accounts garbled his employer into Harrods or Lewis's, and the error has been copied ever since. He was neither a financier nor an aristocrat, and no man of enormous wealth, and he would later go out of his way to say so. His marriage to Jeannette was the marriage she was actually in when the story turned dark, the fact that the snowstorm headlines almost always leave out. His world was John Lewis, not merchant banking, and no amount of retrospective theorising has changed the basic modesty of the life they lived together. Together the Mays did what a certain kind of comfortable English couple did in the 1970s, which was to buy a piece of old Italy and pour their energy into restoring it. They found a farmhouse near Sarnano in the hamlet of Cito, in the region of Marche, a building roughly 300 years old set in the foothills of the Sibillini Mountains, the sort of ancient stone place that comes with a lifetime of repairs attached. A house that old is never finished, only tended, and the tending of it became one of the quiet pleasures of their marriage. Jeannette, with her decorator's eye and her love of beautiful old things, took charge of the renovation, hiring a local geometer, a professional whose Italian role blends the work of a surveyor and an architect, to oversee the building work. For someone who had spent her working life restoring rooms and rescuing furniture, an ancient stone farmhouse in the marsh was less a purchase than a canvas, a chance to do for herself what she had always done for clients. Guerin, with her Italian and her competence, was the natural person to have at her side for such a project, translating between the English owner and the Italian workman. And so the same friendship that ran the antiques trade also ran the renovation. The rhythm of their lives had settled into something ordinary and pleasant, and it was that rhythm, and nothing more sinister, that put the two of them in Sarnano at the end of November 1980. The rhythm of their lives had settled into something modest and pleasant, and it was that rhythm, and nothing more sinister, that put the two of them in Sarnano at the end of November 1980. It is easy to underestimate how ordinary and how happy this arrangement was, and how far it sat from the world of banking dynasties and international intrigue that the later theories would try to drag it into. This was an Englishwoman married to a department store executive, doing up an old farmhouse in a quiet corner of central Italy, arguing about plumbing and buying tiles. She went to Sarnano in late November 1980 to check on that work, the way she had gone many times before. Knowing how the story ends tempts us to see the farmhouse as a trap, but that reading would be false to how it actually felt at the time. A happy project, built on exactly the taste and independence she had spent her whole life assembling. What happened on her last day alive does not read like the actions of a woman walking into an ordinary afternoon. The sequence of events on Saturday, November 29th, 1980, has been pieced together almost entirely from the fragmented accounts of witnesses who encountered the two women that day, and even decades later it remains full of strange, unexplained gaps. At 1 in the afternoon, Jeannette met her geometra, Nazareno Venanzi, for an aperitivo to discuss progress on the farmhouse. During the conversation, she showed him a door she liked for the cabin she was renovating, and then, without explaining why, she asked him to accompany her and Guerin on a sightseeing drive into the Sibillini Mountains later that afternoon. Venanzi declined, telling her plainly that he was busy, and that it was getting late in the day with snow forecast for the evening, and he specifically warned her against going. The warning was as clear as a warning can be, and she disregarded it entirely. She then missed a 2:30 appointment with the farmhouse's previous owner, something witnesses later described as strikingly uncharacteristic of her usual punctuality and reliability. Something had already changed about the shape of her afternoon, though nobody at the time could say what. At around 4 in the afternoon, she was inside a builder's merchant on the outskirts of Sarnano when she received a telephone call. She spoke in English throughout and appeared visibly perturbed once she hung up. When she and Guerin left the shop, a worker there observed them stop, near a red car parked nearby, exchange words with its unidentified driver, and then follow that car toward the town centre. From this point, the timeline grows genuinely confused, with conflicting witness sightings that were never fully reconciled by investigators. Some placed the two women near their hotel around 5, and again in the main piazza around 7 that evening, suggesting they may have briefly returned to town before setting off a second time. Separately, the owner of the Hotel Sibilla, located near the Sassotetto ski resort higher in the mountains, reported seeing the two women accompanied by a man as they drove up through what was already heavy snowfall, though accounts differ on whether this man was in a separate vehicle or riding in their car. Another motorist driving back down through the mountains that same evening recalled passing a man wearing a distinctive white coat, standing at the roadside as if waiting for someone, stationed not far from the exact spot where Jeannette's car would eventually be found. Whatever the precise sequence of stops and encounters and unidentified companions that afternoon, Jeannette and Guerin ultimately drove off in the black Peugeot 104, Sienna plate 216603, toward the high hamlet of Sassotetto, and were caught in a blizzard that continued through the following day. They never returned to their hotel, and they were never again seen alive by anyone who could later be identified. The detail the headline always forgets is the 7 o'clock sighting, because a woman seen descending toward town after dark, hours after setting out, is a woman who had by every appearance survived the mountain and was heading home, and something took her off that safe road and back up into the high country between that glimpse in the piazza and the discovery of an abandoned car far above. A storm did come that night, and they were never seen alive again. But a storm arriving is a different thing from a storm killing. The next morning, Venanzi, growing uneasy after the strange conversation the day before, telephoned the hotel to check whether the two women had slept there, learned they had not, and raised the alarm. A helicopter, ground teams and sniffer dogs were dispatched immediately, but by then overnight snowfall had blanketed the mountains under roughly 3 meters of fresh snow, and the initial search turned up absolutely nothing. It was not until 17 days later, once the snow had partially melted, that a hiker walking through the area inadvertently struck the roof of a snow-covered car with the tip of his walking pole and uncovered the Peugeot, nearly buried in a drift at roughly 900 meters altitude. Everything about the car's condition deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. It was locked, parked neatly at the roadside rather than skidded off it, and in complete working order, with no sign of a struggle either inside the cabin or on the surrounding ground. A woolen scarf sat folded inside the locked car, a detail that struck several observers as deeply inconsistent with two women fleeing on foot into a blizzard, since any rational person caught in such conditions would have grabbed every available piece of warm clothing before stepping outside. Their snowshoes were also found still inside the car, which meant that if the women left on foot, they did so in ordinary driving shoes, not any footwear suited to a mountain trek through deep snow. On December 20th, sniffer dogs, after being allowed to smell the car and its contents, led the search team to an unoccupied stone cottage not far from where the Peugeot sat, a modest structure local shepherds used as a summer refuge. Inside, searchers found the charred remains of a fire fed with broken pieces of the cottage's own wooden furniture, broken up and burned for warmth by people who had nothing else, along with several dirty, used dishes. The scene was physical evidence that the two women had, at some point after leaving their car, taken shelter in a stranger's empty cottage and tried to survive. That small, desperate image tells you more about their final days than any theory has ever managed to, because it is the record of two people doing everything right, finding cover, building a fire, waiting to be found and not being found. Investigators found no way to determine how long the women had stayed or what prompted them to leave it again. Within roughly a year, a new investigating judge in Camerino, Alessandro Jacoboni, moved to reopen the case. After fresh forensic examination revealed something the original investigation had missed entirely. Distinct traces of earth were found, still lodged beneath the Peugeot's tyres, a detail investigators considered fundamentally inconsistent with a car that had simply become stuck in deep snow during a blizzard. The physical evidence led Jacoboni to conclude that the car was deliberately turned around at some point after the women arrived and left in a controlled, parked position on the roadside, rather than skidding off in a panic, as the original theory had assumed. As one long-time Sarnano resident who spent years researching the case later put it, nobody in their right mind would choose to drive up into remote mountains after dark, in worsening weather, just as snow was beginning to fall. Something else had brought them up that road, and something else had left the car locked and neatly parked at the roadside with their warmest clothing still folded inside. The original misadventure theory held that the pair had driven into the mountains, become trapped, abandoned their car, sheltered briefly, and then set out on foot and frozen to death. The earth beneath the tyres and the locked doors and the untouched scarf told a different story entirely. For 14 months, the fate of Jeannette Bishop and Gabriella Guerin remained an open wound for their families and an unsolved puzzle for Italian authorities. On January 27, 1982, hunters walking through woods near Padala, close to the Lago di Fiastra and the hermitage of San Liberato, stumbled upon the two women's remains and scattered personal belongings spread across roughly 200 square meters of ground. The discovery site lay about 5 kilometres from where the Peugeot had been found, a distance investigators later calculated was effectively impossible for two women to cover on foot through 3 meters of snow, dressed as they reportedly were in tights and ordinary shoes. "I hoped right up to the last minute that she would be found alive," Jeannette's mother told reporters when the news reached her. By the time they were located, the remains had badly deteriorated over more than a year of exposure. Wild animals, likely including the wild boar known to roam the region, had significantly damaged the skeletons, and some bones were missing altogether, leaving the forensic picture frustratingly incomplete. The autopsy determined that both women had died at or near the location where their remains were found, rather than closer to the car, and estimated they had likely perished roughly a month after the disappearance, not immediately during the November blizzard. No definitive signs of violent death were detected, though investigators cautioned this was not at all conclusive, given how little skeletal material remained intact. Against that, the Carabinieri's own scientific unit initially suggested something very different, that the bodies were moved after death, an inference drawn from the absence of the decomposition fluids one would expect to find in the soil where a body had lain from the beginning. Two branches of the same investigation, looking at the same remains, disagreed about whether the women had even died where they were found, and that disagreement has never been resolved. Jeannette's identity was confirmed through dental records, her English dentist sending records to Italy to make the match, while Guerin's formal DNA identification would not come until 2006, a quarter of a century later. Then came the single detail that has haunted the case more than any other forensic finding. Both women's wristwatches had stopped, but on different days a full week apart, and yet both had frozen at precisely the same time, 8 minutes to 6. For investigators and journalists who studied the evidence, the seemingly impossible coincidence strongly suggested that someone had deliberately reset or tampered with one of the watches, staging the scene after the fact. If the watches had been kept wound by living hands, then both women survived for well over a week after they vanished, and possibly a great deal longer than that, alone on that mountain in the depths of winter. In December 1982, Jacoboni formally opened a murder file and ordered a fresh autopsy on Guerin. Though Jeannette, by then, had been repatriated to Britain and cremated so that she could never be examined again. By January 1982, Stephen May, who had flown to Italy within days of the disappearance and spent the Christmas season pressing the Carabinieri for answers, had already offered a reward of $208,000 for information. The Carabinieri in Camerino responded, just 4 days later, by floating a straightforward hypothermia explanation, a conclusion May refused to accept, and that the watch evidence, when it came, would make considerably harder to defend. The theories arrived in a rush. The first strange turn had come within a week of Stephen May's arrival in Italy, when a telegram addressed to Jeannette arrived at the hotel where she had been staying, containing 5 words. "I am waiting for you." Investigators traced it to a Rome address that police had already linked, through a separate telegram, to a robbery at the Christie's auction house branch in Piazza Navona, a theft that had occurred the very day after Jeannette and Guerin vanished. That earlier telegram had reportedly indicated to Christie's headquarters where the stolen goods could be located. The connection electrified the investigation and fueled early suspicions that Jeannette, a long-time Christie's auction attendee thanks to her Rothschild-era social connections, was somehow entangled in the theft. Earlier, tabloid headlines from the weeks right after the disappearance had already signalled the direction of public anxiety, with the Telegraph running a story under the headline, "Mystery of Missing Women Deepens as Italian Snows Melt," and other papers printing variations of "Kidnap Alert for Wife" and "Kidnap Fears Grow for Ex-Model." Officials ultimately determined the telegram was a hoax and the Christie's connection a coincidence, but not before it had consumed months of investigative energy and shaped the public narrative around the case. On November 7, 1982, the Sunday Times journalists Gitta Serini and Dalbert Hallenstein published a 20-page feature concluding that Jeannette and Guerin had been victims of a commissioned kidnapping. Serini brought relevant prior experience, having covered the case of Rolf Schild, a businessman kidnapped in Sardinia, because his captors mistakenly believed his surname was Rothschild. The reporters reasoned that Jeannette, still carrying the Rothschild name on her passport out of convenience, may have fallen victim to a similarly mistaken targeting, and they pointed to the 2 stopped watches as evidence that a captor had staged the scene. The theory's most glaring weakness was one the journalists never resolved, because Evelyn de Rothschild stated flatly that he had never received any ransom demand for his former wife. From that first theory, the case spread outward into ever darker territory. A Rome antiques dealer and drug smuggler named Sergio Vaccari was found murdered in his Holland Park flat in September 1982, stabbed 15 times, and Jeannette's name reportedly appeared in his diary. Photographs of goods stolen from the Christie's robbery were said to have turned up in Vaccari's safe, and Vaccari himself was linked by some accounts to Roberto Calvi, the financier known as God's banker, who was found hanged beneath Blackfriars Bridge in June of that same year. A senior Scotland Yard detective, asked about the supposed link, said flatly, "There is not a shred of evidence that Mrs. May ever knew Vaccari." In 2013, a photographer named Marco Fassoni Accetti, already notorious as a self-proclaimed witness in several Roman disappearance cases, including that of the Vatican employee's daughter, Emanuela Orlandi, alleged that a shadowy network had considered recruiting Jeannette into a blackmail scheme targeting the Vatican, saying the group sought high-ranking ladies who gravitated in the milieu between Italian diplomacy and Vatican City. He insisted, however, that the plan never advanced to contact, writing that Jeannette was never contacted, and that her disappearance is an event completely unrelated to our activities. In 1985, when Italian police arrested a reputed mafia figure at the very same Rome address that had been linked to the mysterious telegram, a Daily Mirror columnist could only remark, "Odd, innit?" The theories were seductive precisely because the truth was so thin, and the story of what the name could and could not explain was about to enter its strangest chapter yet. By September 25, 1989, the investigating magistrate formally overturned the original hypothermia ruling, concluding instead that the deaths constituted a double homicide by unknown means and unknown perpetrators. Central to the ruling was the sheer geographical impossibility, because forensic experts calculated that the roughly 9-kilometre distance between the car and the bodies was beyond what 2 women could traverse on foot through that depth of snow and wind. Months later, a different magistrate reviewing the same file concluded that while homicide was plausible, murder could not be proved to the standard required for charges against any specific person, and with no identifiable suspect or surviving lead to pursue, file number 2736/1980 was formally consigned to Italy's cold case archive. For the women's families, and for Stephen May in particular, who had spent years funding investigative journalism and pressing the Carabinieri for answers, the outcome was a bitter anticlimax, an official acknowledgement that his wife had likely been murdered, paired with an admission that the Italian justice system had no realistic path toward ever identifying who was responsible. The file sat dormant for the next 35 years, occasionally stirred by the press and the true crime programmes that could never quite let it rest. The case's long hibernation ended in November 2024, when the Italian crime news magazine show Quarto Grado aired a segment titled Il Giallo della Baronessa, and revealed that the Macerata prosecutor Giovanni Fabrizio Narbone had quietly begun reopening the file. "We have reviewed all records to identify any indications of inconsistencies, and we believe there is a chance to get to the bottom of this," Narbone told the Italian news agency ANSA, adding that the answer probably has nothing to do with the international scenarios hypothesized, but is still there, in Sarnano, where everything happened. As part of the renewed investigation, prosecutors arranged hearings for more than 20 witnesses, with a particular focus on elderly locals who might still recall details of the women's last hours. Venanzi, the surveyor and one of the last people to speak with Jeannette, recalled to reporters that on the morning of November 29th, she had shown him a door she liked for the cabin, describing her as charming, a former model with refined manners before he learned of her Rothschild connections. Retired General Carlo Felice Corsetti, who had served as a lead investigator on the original case and was by 77 years old, offered his own pointed assessment of why the case merited re-examination. There are several unclear investigative elements that do not fit the theory that their deaths were caused by the cold. That is the mystery. One Sarnano resident told the Telegraph simply, "No one around here ever thought it was an accident or misfortune. After 40 years, there is something else." The filmmaker Alessandro Galassi, who grew up in Macerata and produced a documentary about the case, put its grip more plainly. "People talk about Jeannette May like it's a case that happened yesterday. It's a legend." Back in England, the Daily Mail's Richard Kay visited Stephen May at his home and found the nonagenarian, by then approaching 90, on his way out to a tennis lesson. May declined to comment directly, but sources close to him called the decades of kidnapping and Vatican and mafia theories preposterous and nonsense. Kay himself offered a verdict that seemed to sum up more than 4 decades of speculation. None of it made much sense then, and it doesn't make much sense now. It's a mystery, and I think it will remain a mystery. The name that opened every door in Jeannette Bishop's life has so far kept every door to the truth about her death firmly shut.